Good afternoon and good evening. I'm Mike Sprague. I'm the director of the Polar Institute and also director of the Global Risk and Resilience Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I want to thank our technical team for troubleshooting what has become known to all of us as gremlins in the system as we all continue our world on Zoom. So thanks to our technical team for getting us back up and running. Today is the second in a series entitled Arctic Security Dialogues, and we're very happy to work with our friends at the Arctic Domain Awareness Center to bring to you these series. As you may recall, in early October, we held the first of these dialogues entitled United States Department of Air Force Arctic Strategy, Perspectives and Insights, and that was a fruitful and informative discussion. This relationship with the Arctic Domain Awareness Center is important to the Wilson Center, but it's also, I think, important to any of us who are involved in Arctic issues. So on behalf of my colleagues at the Polar Institute and my partner in this initiative, Major General Randy Church-Key, we're very pleased to facilitate today's program entitled Toward a U.S. Army Arctic Strategy. I want to thank A2A Railways and Algoonic Corporation from Wainwright, Alaska for their continued support of our efforts at the Wilson Center throughout the year. I also want to thank our friends at the University of the Arctic, as well as colleagues at the Canada Institute and the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Wilson Center. Both Church and I would like you to know that we want you to be a part of this program. So please send in your questions at polar@wilsoncenter.org, polar@wilsoncenter.org. Those questions will be given to Church and I, and we will then come back to the panelists after each has spoken to then engage with your questions and your thoughts. As we know, the Arctic has changed and continues to change. As noted in NOAA's recently released 2020 Arctic Scorecard, the Arctic continues to heat at an alarming rate, with implications for the circumpolar North, our planet, and our global community. The magnitude of this change is literally reconfiguring the environment and the contours of our Arctic. Political, social, economic, security, all those landscapes are changing in the region. In response to these changes, civil and national security leadership in the United States are reevaluating the needs of the nation, as well as our Arctic communities, and either implementing existing plans and strategies or developing new strategies that better address emerging challenges and threats. It's clear to me there is a quickening in the Arctic, whether it be the changing physical landscape, the evolving geopolitical landscape, the promise of an increased development and increased commerce, or the growing interest from our non-Arctic nations. It is clear the Arctic is not what it used to be. And so today, we will hear from those responsible for both informing and influencing the United States Army Arctic Strategy, as well as experts in the field who will provide insight into the issues and dynamics the Army should consider during their planning process. It's now a pleasure to introduce my colleague, the Director of the Arctic Domain Awareness Center and Polar Institute Global Fellow, Major General Randy Church-Key, to begin our program. Church, the program is yours.
Dr. Schrager, thank you so very much. I'll emphasize the word is retired. I'm privileged of serving, but now at the point of as a former member of the United States Air Force and the privilege of serving in that great organization for 30 plus some years. It's a privilege to co-host this event with Dr. Schrager and the Wilson Center, and it's also a privilege to be part of Mike's team as one of his global fellows. The Arctic is exceptional. Arctic exceptionalism in the size, breadth, and depth of ongoing collaboration in Arctic science, economic endeavors, indigenous peoples' concerns, military cooperation, and governance-related activities are really kind of the envy for many across the globe. Continuing Arctic exceptionalism is by no means assured, and U.S. investments in Arctic initiatives such as science, economics, and measures to ensure American sovereignty and security should rightly be top U.S. priorities. The diminishing ice environment, of course, is enabling a rise of competition between national powers. For example, the Russian Federation refurbished former Soviet Arctic bases, built additional ones that's capable of projecting power to and through the Arctic region. With a dominant number of icebreakers, Russia can project surface forces in multiple directions simultaneously. Russian national decision-making and defense planning are certainly opaque at best, and Russia's Arctic military strategies should be met with resolve and determination on the Americans' perspective, we cannot afford to be weak in our resolve as perceived by the Kremlin. Conversely, the People's Republic of China advances influence the use of its economic power to gain access across the Arctic. China is normalizing an Arctic presence via nationally owned icebreakers, gaining port access, and advancing mining interests. Against this backdrop, the Wilson Center and ADAC are honored to host this session towards a U.S. Army Arctic strategy, which is a discussion in support of the developing U.S. Army's Arctic strategy, and it's a conversation that's intended to contribute hopefully meaningful perspectives, which includes, of course, retired U.S. Army general officers who have knowledge and a perspective to share with regards to the strategic interests of the Arctic region, along with some suggestions that are potentially hopefully helpful for developing the U.S. Army's Arctic strategy from a planning, policy, and our operational vantage point. The classic orientation of a strategy is to address, of course, ends, ways, and means, which in sum is the desired outcome. The approach is to achieve the outcomes. The instruments employed to the approaches to achieve those desired outcomes. For the U.S. Arctic region and the surrounding region of interest, the ends of the strategy perhaps are things such as a region of peace and developing free of foreign intervention. The ways are things such as a plurality, which is an effective and combined application of diplomacy measures, economic investment, environmental protections, informational understandings, and security and defense posture that deters and dissuades both state and non-state actors from violating U.S. sovereign territory, harming our citizens and other property, illegally seizing marine life, mineral resources, all as part of our sovereign presence in the U.S. extended economic zone of our nation. As part of the U.S. Joint Force, the U.S. Army roles in this equation is to train, equip, and prepare soldiers and formations for employment to protect U.S. national interests in the Arctic region and span the full range of crisis contingencies ordered by Unified Command and National Command authorities that range from civil defense, essentially the hand of help versus the clenched fist of resolve to again protect the U.S. homeland. So that is the desired outcome. It's my privilege as we now move into this conversation, we have, of course, representing the Department of the Army, Colonel J.P. Clark from the Department of Army Strategy and Development, the Army Strategy Session of the United States Army. We call there. We also have the Commander of U.S. Army Alaska, Major General Peter Andresiak. And we have a distinguished group of folks to help support Colonel Clark and General Andresiak in this effort. Lieutenant General retired Mike Shields, Lieutenant General retired Burke Garrett, Major General Randy Staudenrouse, Brigadier General Pat Carpentier, former DASD Jim Townsend, and former Air Force strategy developer, Ms. Iris Ferguson, and former DASD for Environmental Affairs, Honorable Sherry Goodman. This is the lineup of the remarkable set of folks. We begged and borrowed and steeled to get more time from the Wilson Center for this group of patriots to offer their reflections from both Canada and the United States. With this in mind, it is my privilege to bring to our first opener, if you will, Colonel J.P. Clark, representing the Department of the Army Strategy Section, Major General Brad Garricky. Colonel J.P. Clark is the Chief of the Strategy Division within the Army G357. And he was commissioned as Armor Officer in '97. He served in tank battalions in Fort Stewart, Georgia, and the Republic of Korea. From those tactical begins, he now has moved into the business of strategy and development. He is a lead author for the Army in multi-domain operations, joint concept, integrated campaigning, and more. He holds a PhD, and something that not too many folks should have the opportunity to do that and serve at the same time. So quite a remarkable patriot, and we're honored to have Colonel Clark offer some reflections overall on the developing Army strategy, again, representing his boss, Major General Brad Garricky. Colonel Clark, sir, I will respectfully give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much, sir. Thanks to you and Dr. Sfraga for putting this together, the Wilson Center and all of your partners, and this really amazing panel that you put together. We are looking forward to it, and I'd like to, as you had said, General Garricky was originally committed to this, and unfortunately, as many people who are familiar with the U.S. military and U.S. government know about the Friday afternoon inevitable emergency, and unfortunately, he and General Flynn are working on that right now. So with that, I would just like to frame what we're doing really quickly, because some observers might find it strange that a military department is producing a strategy for a region. Certainly that is with the overall policy for regions are should be handled by bodies like the NSC, OSD within DoD or state, and so it's not the typical place that a military department will play. Or in terms of the employment of forces, typically that is the remit of the geographic combatant commands in terms of how we're going to handle the employment of forces overseas. But I'd like to describe for the group real briefly the two kind of threads that led to this strategy being written, and that will also help explain exactly why we're structuring it as we are, because it's a little bit different than the typical strategy of ends, ways, means. The two things that have led into this is first, very simply, General McConville, the Chief of Staff, has been moving around the Army in the Pacific. In July, he had a Pacific trip, went out to Alaska, and it really struck him how much our ability to operate in the Arctic, the subarctic regions, just basically, extreme cold weather and extreme conditions had really deteriorated over time. Obviously, the last 2 decades of conflict have focused us in other regions, and so it really struck him just how much we've lost in our capability to operate in that specific environment. And now the other thing is that we do have oversight, and that there is the Department of Defense Arctic strategy, and so we are nested within that, and so that's providing us the policy framework that we feel like we can go ahead and we can offer some ideas about how Army forces can operate as part of the joint force, of course, can operate as part of multinational and combined forces, and that is what we're setting out to do. And as many of the people on this call understand, probably better than I do, because the Arctic falls along several different seams within the Unified Campaign Plan, there probably is a place for the Army to come in and help provide some knit together some of what our Army service components are doing, as we have 3 different areas of operation are being handled, as well as some of the functional combatant commands also have a big stake in this as well. So from those beginnings and those 2 needs, we have a 2-part strategy, really. So the first part is a focus on simply doing what military departments do, and General Key had mentioned this. We man, equip, train forces, and so building back what we're calling Arctic capability. But really, in more technical terms, we're going through all of the what people will be familiar with, what we call DOTMLPF, doctrine, organization, training, materiel. All of those things are requires to field forces, credible forces, and we are defining that very broadly in terms of extreme cold weather and also mountainous terrain. And so they're not going to be solely of use only within the Arctic. They can be used around the world, anywhere you find those sorts of extreme environments. And that will help start, getting after what the chief had noticed in his trip. And so we're focusing on a number of items of training, personnel, and then of course, obviously equipment is a big factor. The second part of the strategy is in some ways a concept for employment. Once again, we do not want to overstep our bounds as a military department, but I do quite a bit of talking, certainly on a weekly, sometimes on a daily basis, with the G5s for the U.S. Army Pacific, Europe, and Army North, which has the Homeland Defense mission, and making sure that we understand producing forces that are able to operate across those seams. But then actually, I should also say 2 things that make this particularly pertinent right now as well is, one, obviously, as we talk about great power competition in relation to the 2018 National Defense Strategy and whatever might come next out of the next administration, we anticipate that there'll probably be a similar recognition that we are dealing with adversaries who can pose a threat to the homeland, which is something we haven't had to deal with for quite a while. And so there's the extra threat, and then also as both speakers who had opened this up mentioned, the changing Arctic offers new paths for enemies to attack us potentially. But then also on the flip side, and so looking at opportunities, the Army's multi-domain operations concept is providing forces with much greater reach. And so as we start getting into mid-range capability, which will potentially go out to several hundreds, thousands of miles. We talk about long-range hypersonic weapons, which will be fielded here before too long. That allows the Army to play a role as part of the joint force that it hasn't had before. And so it just naturally behooves us to take a look at that across the world. But the Arctic being such a strategic area of such importance, certainly we should take a hard look to understand what sort of opportunities the Army can do to open up new operational approaches for the joint force. So where are we in this process? As I mentioned, late July, as the chief came back from his Pacific trip, that was when we actually formally started on the process, although there had been a little bit of preparatory work before, just because we knew that this is an area of such importance. We have at this point, we've completed our first staffing at the colonel level throughout the Army. And we think that we have a pretty good bead at this point of what are all of the different factors that we should consider in terms of both the specifics of building capability, as well as we also think that we've done enough coordination across the different Army service component commands that we are kind of zeroing in on a couple of options for the secretary and the chief to consider in terms of how we want to reconfigure our forces and how we want to project power and be a part of the joint force. Now, and so with that kind of a scene setting, we've been able to identify some things that we are convinced that the Army absolutely must do. And so one example, pulling from the first bin of building capabilities, is we just simply have to rebuild the domain expertise through training, both at the individual level, but also at the collective level. Something that I don't want to get ahead of myself and take some of General Andresiak's comments, but we know that we have to be able to train units to operate in this environment at echelon, not simply train individuals to survive. And so that is a task that we are confident when we publish, most likely in February, we can say the Army absolutely must and will improve our training. But we still have not done all of the analysis in order to allow us to tell us, what specific changes we need to make in policy, what changes we need to resource. And so there's a second tier of tasks that fall underneath those first tiers must-dos, and those are the ones that we are considering. Now this, as General Gericke likes to say, this is not a glossy strategy that you can put on the shelf that has a high production value, but that will never get anything done. As we've gone through, we're writing at the classified level, and we are also identifying who exactly in the Army is going to be responsible for delivering each of these subtasks, and identifying all of the additional agencies, organizations, and staff sections that have to support them as they do that. And so this is an action plan that will be very easily translated into a headquarters department of the Army execution order, into the Army campaign plan, into directives signed by the secretary and the chief for action. Nonetheless, because there's still, we have to do consultations. Sometimes this requires consultations with OSD, joint staff, with the combatant commands. A lot of the tasks initially are going to set a very firm idea of what we want to decide. And then there will be a fixed term for the study and analysis to do. And basically they can come back with the pros and the costs of pursuing any of these changes. And so there'll be a lot of these second tier tasks that we would expect the Secretary and the Chief will be making decisions on within a year or two. But at the same time, we're not quite ready to this is not a reveal strategy that's going to say all the things that have been decided. We need to set things in motion and work through the proper processes. Once again, I said, I think that should be coming out in February. Next week, we're going to push it out for its first general officer level CHOP. And then we expect that and we're working on a very fast timeline. And so we expect to get to the Secretary and the Chief probably at the end of January or early February, depending upon how much divergence we find out in our staffing. So once again, my apologies on behalf of General Gerke that he couldn't make it. Thanks to the Wilson Center and all the partners for setting this up. And with that, I will turn it back on over to you, General Key, and I have my pen is ready, and so I'm ready to take all of the knowledge from this group.
Thank you, Colonel Clark. Let me give the floor to Dr. Shrega.
Colonel Clark, thank you very much for that. It was exactly what we were hoping for. Thank you for taking the time to slot in to provide that update. I think you provided us great insight. Wonderful to know about the progress and also the various components of the strategy that's currently under development. I think you've laid a great foundation for the rest of our program today. Certainly, the stream here now to our next speaker fits very nicely for a number of reasons into what you have provided for us. So it's a pleasure to welcome now Major General Peter Andresiak, the commander of U.S. Army Alaska, Joint Base Elmendorf, Richardson, Alaska. General, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'd like to start by thanking the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Arctic Domain Awareness Center for hosting this event. So Church and Mike, thanks to you both for moderating and facilitating, which I know will be a great discussion, and special thanks in advance to those on the panel today. So I look forward to your thoughts and perspectives. And I also like to thank JP on behalf of General Gerke for being here today and helping set the stage for this. While you talked about a lot of the bigger, more strategic things that you're working on, what I want to get at today really is where we can already move out and set some context for you there. Because I think we all in agreement that the context that was already laid out by Church and Mike, that it's extremely important, obviously very complex as we work through this, but there are a number of things that we can get after right now. So what I will lay out for you are really the things that, it's already been set in motion. There's coordination that's been done across the Army enterprise to get this rolling and start building the readiness that we've talked about and alluded to. So I'll try to do my best to tee that up. So, as JP mentioned, this has gotten a lot of momentum pretty fast. When the chief was here in the summer, I think the thing that U.S. Army Alaska is largely struggled with is this idea that we're the proponent for the Army for cold weather training. We live in Alaska, but we've been focused elsewhere. And then just trying to understand, how much time were we supposed to spend or allocate towards the task of being able to fight or operate in the environment, which is extremely cold. It's snow. It is elevation or extreme terrain, but I would also tell you it's not just operating in the coldest part of the year. If it is the Arctic, because we are trying to build readiness where we can operate in different COCOMs, it is in the summertime, the Arctic is a different problem. And we do need to factor that in. And so General McConnell said he wanted to move out on this. And so DAMO SS has been doing a lot of work, a lot of coordination across the enterprise. And just last week, we hosted the Army's Arctic Symposium with U.S. Army Pacific and General Camera. And the Army Enterprise was plugged into that, and the Chief of Staff of the Army opened and closed it. The Chief of Staff has been here no fewer than 3 times. The Secretary of the Army has been here a couple of times as well, all very interested in this. So we got the support of the Army leadership as we go forward. As mentioned by JP, they want to roll this out by February, but I will tell you by February, we're already going to be training. We're already doing it now. We've already changed how U.S. Army Alaska focuses its training because we've gotten enough guidance to move on. I'll try to walk you through that. So if I were to kind of paint, the Army's current capability to operate in the environment, it's described as atrophied. It's atrophied because we once had it, and we no longer necessarily have the skills that we once had. And so at that Arctic Symposium that we ran last week, there was a session that was done Thursday, and then the big Army session in a more classified environment was done on Friday. But General Shields led the session on Thursday that was graybeards. It's the former Arctic warriors that talked about the heyday of when U.S. Army Alaska was really good at operating in and through the environment. And that really peaked in the early 90s when the focuses went to combat training centers and eventually to combat deployments. But we learned a lot about how they operated. And in some cases, they were putting 27,000 soldiers and the joint force in the field in any given year for brimfrost. And it was truly joint, and they were good at what they did. They weren't limited to infrastructure, but that's not where we sit today. Where we sit today is every 2 years we run Arctic Edge, which is the NORTHCOM premier homeland defense exercise. And we usually put companies out to run very limited missions for 24 to 36 hours at a time. But that's really it. We're not training at duration. We're not training at echelon and scale. And that's largely been driven by the focus coming out of the early 90s to go to combat training centers. And then, of course, in 2000, the global war on terror, right, which drove brigade combat teams into CENTCOM on a regular basis. And the Army went through a massive transformation, and it went to a BCT-centric Army, and it tried to standardize much of the equipment and organizational structure that we had once had a very niche capability. And so the equipment was largely very similar across the force, and we no longer had niche capabilities to operate in very unique environments. And so that focus, whether it's combat training centers or whether it was in the CENTCOM or worldwide deployments, took our attention away from that. And where we've wound up is this very niche capability, where we don't have the niche capability, we have a limited capability and capacity to operate for extended periods. And part of the bigger challenge is that focus drove us to really start training in March and end training by October to hit the gates that we needed to in the better parts of the year. And then what we did was the winter was primarily focused at building individual readiness so we wouldn't get frostbite in March or frostbite in October. And so in that battle rhythm, what we call the annual battle rhythm, is extremely important to set in place in Alaska. If you want to build the readiness, you got to go back to this annual cycle of how we want to actually build the readiness and train in the coldest parts of the year. And then if you look at our modernization output was largely focused on individual or maybe crew equipment, right? And we've made changes in the clothing that we wear. We've not made a lot of progress on skis, snowshoes, where I think we're in great place, but we're still operating with the same Akio. We're operating with the same 10-man Arctic tents. But the larger organizational equipment has not evolved or adapted over time. And when I explained that to the chief of staff in the summer, largely what we do to our equipment is the same thing that you get added to a car at a local dealership if you go buy it. That's not Arctic adapted, and it's definitely not Arctic design. And so the desired end state of where we want to get to, I think, is in line with Army's Waypoint 2028, where we can operate, deploy, fight, win decisively against any adversary, anytime, anywhere, in a joint and multi-domain. But it also, anytime, anywhere, implies, the varying extreme cold, snow, and then I would say rugged terrain. And they're all different problem sets. And I don't want to get into the details because we've identified a number of gaps. When I say operating on the margins, that's starting training in March, ending training in October. We have some significant gaps. And to get to the end state, we really got to do, one, we got to start training again. And then we got to be able to do this .mil-PF assessment. So it's a gap analysis to see where the significant shortfalls, and that will go back really to the Army enterprise for them to decide where they want to invest, how they want to invest, what they want to adapt or not in the scope and scale. That's not my charter. My charter is to go out and start building that readiness again. And so what all I needed from my boss was General LeCamera saying, hey, you're not going south for the winter. You're not going to go somewhere else and train for the winter, or you're not going to use the winters to ship your equipment to a combat training center. You're going to now focus training in the winter. All right. And so as we look to how do we rebuild and restart that, we had a decent foundation. And so there's really a hierarchy in terms of how we approached it. At the very base of this hierarchy is we needed the equipment to be able to survive. So we have the individual clothing and equipment that we have. We have some skis, we have some snowshoes, some Akios in Arctic 10-man tents. We didn't have enough for the whole force. You got to have the ability to protect your force if you're operating out there. And so General LeCameron did a big buy on that and set conditions. The big gap I think we have right now, at its heyday, there were 700 SUSFEs in U.S. Army or in Alaska. We're down to now 50. So when you look at our ability for overland mobility, it's extremely limited because the wheeled vehicle fleet that we have is largely, there are impacts. You have to focus on roadways, and even on roadways, 16 or 18 inches of snow becomes significant limitations. So that is not a gap that we can close relatively quickly. So what that does is it limits where we can train. And so largely as we step out on this, it is tied more to infrastructure, but we do have a strategy to get us out into the more remote areas, because if we want to operate in and through the Arctic, whether it's Homeland Defense or DISCA, we got to have the equipping capabilities that do get us there. So at that foundational level, we've made a significant infusion of money to buy the equipment, and then units have already been out training. Because at the next level of this is, how do you train and certify your leaders, right, to regain the skill set, right, and the field craft so that their soldiers can survive in that environment. And we have the Northern Warfare Training Center, so we've always had that. It's about putting a renewed emphasis on that and looking at the capacity to get the leaders out there. And so we did that. And then what we got to do is then take those leaders, send them back to your unit, and they got to go through and give all of the soldiers in their formation the training that they need to be able to operate in the environment, to survive, because we're just focusing at the Maslow's hierarchy of survival, is we're trying to get just the foundation really in place. And so units have gone back, and we have this cold weather indoctrination training, and there's 3 levels of it. Level 1 is, sit in the classroom. Level 2 is get out, get comfortable with your equipment, use the tents, and level 3 is collective training. And right now we have units in the field at battalion level doing low-level collective training, but at echelon, they are out training in the field to set conditions, because what was also decided on is we're going to do a larger exercise every year in February. And we've called that the Arctic Warrior Series. We're putting the Arctic back in Arctic Warrior, and that big event takes place in February. And that's where we're going to get to. And then in that hierarchy, at the higher levels, as we operate more at higher levels in longer durations at echelon, there's more that we're going to pull back and learn, and we'll be able to feed the Army, and we'll be able to get some momentum and build on that. So let me talk to the chart that Church put up there for me, because this is really how we get at the higher end. And we got some bigger ideas that are in here that we're working. And I think there's a lot of these that we have the ability to shape and work with my peers. And I just want to highlight really the 5 lines of effort that we're going to get to in the near term. And this is only out in a couple of years. We have this build out to 2028, but I just want to hit the wave tops of this to help you understand that. I'm not going to talk about major competitor events, because a big piece of this is competition. I think what we do and how we train at echelon and duration is going to have a competitive bounce. But this is where we're moving out in terms of the Army. So I'll start on that lead line of effort. And at the top of that, there's this recognition that talent management is an issue. The expertise is gone. How do you get the expertise? How do you keep the expertise? And so there's an initiative right now that we're working with Recruiting Command to bring in soldiers that live in areas that are probably more apt to thrive in this particular environment. So we go out and do recruiting. If you're a soldier that joins the Army out of Alaska, can we get you an assignment to Alaska? If you come out of Colorado, how do we kind of streamline those that have that unique skill set, knowing this is going to be a focus? And Recruiting Command thinks this is very possible. There's a policy aspect of that, but the near-term bridging strategy is this. We're looking at the Center for Initial Military Training, where we have soldiers that are already in the training base. How do we query them, raise their hand, and get them up here? Versus now it's a little bit more of a random process on who winds up here. And so we're trying to get a little bit more control and get the right folks up here. And then Human Resources Command is make sure that if you've left here and you have the expertise, is to be able to get them back here at the more senior leader level, and then we can retain them. And so you're building a real pool of expertise. So we have a talent management approach to this, and it's feasible, and we're working a lot of that right now and getting some progress. At the Northern Warfare Training Center, while I mentioned that that's in place already, we do need to figure out what's the right capacity that we need to have at that particular school. Do we need to grow it? And then how does as the Army decides who's going to else come and operate in this environment, do we got to go grow the capacity to build these leaders and send them back to their unit at Fort Carson or Fort Drum, so because they're going to come out and participate in the next Arctic Edge exercise in 2022 or 2024. But we got to do the analysis, because if there is growth, there's two ways to do it. I can tax my units, provide more instructors, but that's at the expense of my unit's training, or we go back to the Army and the Army agrees to augment my TDA and grow the organizational structure. At the same time, we're also looking at, we run a mountaineering course in the summer time frame, is where does mountaineering fit into all of this? In World War II, the 10th Mountain Division, while it was a bunch of skiers that we recruited into a division thinking that we were going to ski, it was their mountaineering skills that played out and made them successful in Italy. So we're going to do some analysis of the mountaineering piece of this, which is also important, because I'll talk later about what General LeCamera has asked us to do with the Indian Army and the focus of training with them in the Himalayas in a mountainous environment. We have got to get that expertise in our force. It is very limited because it's not been a point of emphasis. And then on the last portion of the lead line, you'll see this ARLDP. That's the Arctic Region Leader Development Program that we're trying to work internally. How do you build the expertise in this particular environment? And so we could obviously leverage the expertise of Polar Institute, the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, and now that we have the Ted Stevens Arctic Center, looks like if it's going to go through in the NDAA, how do we leverage the center if it's here and build out this curriculum? And then, so U.S. Army Pacific has a great program that they do in the Pacific that is really focused on Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. We want to mirror that as well to put more investment in the leader development of our force. On the train piece, I've highlighted that every year we're going to do this, we have a big aim point. February is this brigade level exercise. It's the Arctic Warrior Series. We need to expand that to the Joint Force. And we chose February because it largely aligns with Arctic Edge that takes place every 2 years. And I think this is a great opportunity for synergy to align a big Army exercise with a big point of emphasis that NORTHCOM has. And as they bring in a lot of resources, how do you get those lined up and have a significant force presence and do that? And then what we're also looking at is adjusting some of the Pacific exercises, one of which is UTABOS with India. It is now coming back to U.S. Army Alaska. The focus is no longer the desert or that type of terrain. The focus is mountainous, cold environment. And so in 2021, we will host them here in Alaska. 2022, it's supposed to be in the Himalayas. And so we're developing that particular program right now. Combat training centers, I listed that on there because as we began in the infancy, combat training centers were still on the calendar. I think there's some potential evolution to pull the combat training centers out. For U.S. Army Alaska, the near term is 125 Stryker Brigade is no longer going to the National Training Center in March. It's giving us time to build this capability and skill set. But as we look towards the future, while we're not going to build out a combat readiness training center here, part of our strategy is to actually bring units up here to train, which leads me to the line that says TSS. And that's really our ranges and the investment in range infrastructure. In Alaska, for U.S. Army Alaska, I have ranges at Fort Richardson. I have ranges up at Fort Wainwright, and I got ranges down near Fort Greely. And we invest in all of them with not a cohesive or coherent strategy. A lot of them is about investing in ranges that we need at very low levels of readiness. We've laid out a strategy that creates maneuver space really from Fort Wainwright and the Tanana Flats all the way down into the Donnelly Training Area, which is at Greeley. And that is over 100 kilometers of space to potentially maneuver and shoot into, which the Secretary was very interested in potentially training or testing some of the high-end capabilities that they're building out in the Army right now with Army's Futures Command. And so I think that that's a strategy we'll also then be able to work with the Joint Force. When I pitched this to General Crum, he was extremely interested because the Air Force is investing in its sensors up at the Yukon training area, which is near Eielson, when we could be investing in these sensors down in what would be a real joint training area where the Joint Pacific Alaska Range Complex can actually be a joint training area. So I think there's opportunities. We got a basic plan laid out, and that's what we want to work there. I'm not going to go too much in the equipping and manning side, because as we come out of this training, how we change our equipment, how we change our organization and manning, that's really a big Army decision. I think the key piece of this is Futures Command is tied with us at the hip now. So we have the right folks that understand when we're going to go out and train. So we're going to start aligning their operational testing with our exercises so that there are more soldier touch points on the things they're already working on. As all the centers of excellence in the Army are going to converge here for this training event, and they're going to do this .mil-PF analysis. There's a rapid capabilities assessment listed under the organize and man line. They're going to collect a bunch of data, and then all the centers of expertise, general officers led by General Rainey at the Combined Arms Center, they're going to then read out this .mil-PF gap analysis, which will then go back and potentially feed structural changes in the formations. The Army's going through a transition now from that brigade-centric Army that we built in the early 2000s, going back for large-scale combat operations to division-centric forces. Part of that is changing the structure of brigade combat teams. And so we're looking at is how do we then go back and build that niche capability where the brigades in Alaska are unique compared to the other brigades across the Army, and then the Army decides how much more of that investment needs to go elsewhere. So that's what that's really about. There's a lot of work that's got to be done in there, but it's going to be informed by this training that we do, bringing this experts here to pull the data, feed it back into the Army enterprise for higher level decisions that JP has discussed. And then I'll finish out on the inform, influence, engage, and educate. The first line of that is, we belong to the Indo-Pacific. We have relationships with Japan. We have relationships with Canada. We got to redefine our relationships so they're not just based off of airborne capabilities, but they're based off of cold weather capabilities. So part of that is I already discussed India. So we're looking at the rest of the Indo-PACOM partners. How do we redefine the security cooperation aspect of the relationships? As part of the Arctic Symposium, General Cavoli was all about bringing U.S. Army Alaska into the European Arctic partners and then evolving those relationships. So he said, hey, get out to Norway quick as possible, right? And start building that relationship and look at what Norway does. Norway, for example, runs 2 fleets of equipment because the summer problem is different from the winter problem. So they run a dual fleet, right? But that's the only way that we're going to be able to figure out where we need to go is learn from our partners that have been investing, live in this environment, have been training. So we're going to expand that to the European Arctic partners. And of course, there's a key aspect of that is in terms of what do we do with the Alaskan natives? We got to deepen that relationship because we need to understand the environment that we operate in. We got to understand the culture where we live. The Alaska experience can only be lived through the Alaska natives, but there is so much that they know that we need to be able to partner with them and understand better as we build out the capabilities. If we want to move from surviving to thriving, there got to be a piece of that equation as we go and build this out in terms of the strategy. And then the last part of that really is on the educate side. U.S. Army Alaska, if we're going to be at the tip end of the spear of this endeavor, we got to do a better job of educating the rest of the Army, leveraging all the various symposiums, speaking at events such as this, and then even the Association of the United States Army is getting a more prominent place in there and sharing lessons learned. I apologize for probably going a little long, but I just wanted to basically set that up for you, and I appreciate the time and everything that you guys are doing. We look forward to your feedback on and how we can develop a better strategy and way forward. Thanks a lot.
General, thank you very much. No apologies at all. That was needed, comprehensive, helpful, useful, insightful. I really appreciate that, and perfect follow-up with the Colonel's remarks. As an Alaskan, I have to say that what you have provided is not just a vision for our state, but where our state fits for the rest of the nation. And in fact, all of our allies and friends around the world when it comes to Arctic training. I have a number of questions for you and the Colonel. I'm going to wait, like everyone else, to the end of the panel discussions. I want to thank those who are sending in their email. Again, polar@wilson.org. We have hundreds of people online with a lot of questions coming. General, thank you very much. Church, let me turn it back over to you to now move into the panel discussion, but I would just warn our speakers that there are lots of questions coming in. Thank you.
Dr. Schreger, thank you very, very much. And General Andresiak, I personally copied 43 line items of great reflections here to try to pull through. I also got some text in from my personal cell phone that I need to factor in addition to what Wilson's getting. But that was a tour de force of conversation. So thank you for that. That was a great investment and hopefully help really salt the rest of the conversation in a very robust and meaningful way. We now have an opportunity, again, after we go through the panels, we will invite both Colonel Clark and General Andresiak back to the panel for the question session. So that's what, in case that wasn't clear earlier. And again, they just heard great reflections from the Commander of Record, Major General Peter Andresiak, Commander of the United States Army, Alaska. And now we're going to the panel, starting off in sequence right now. It's my privilege to welcome to the stage Lieutenant General Retired Mike Shields, who has served in multiple levels within U.S. Army Alaska, to include, of course, serving as the commander of U.S. Army Alaska, and then culminating in a distinguished career as the director of the Joint Improvised Explosive Device Defeat Organization, JIADO, in Washington, D.C. As a reminder, all but Colonel Clark's bios are available at the website. We will post Colonel Clark's biography following this session today. So you can read about a summary about General Shields' experiences on the website. And of course, he's highly searchable online, and you can learn a lot of details about this great champion of goodness. I'd like to give the floor to my good friend, Lieutenant General Retired Mike Shields. Mike, you got the floor.
Church, thanks for that introduction. I'm going to try to eliminate some of the redundancies from mine and Pete's excellent presentation. I think I'll start with, I organize my talking points by the environment and man, train, equip, and organize. And I'll start with environment here. The thing to highlight, from my experience is the seasonality of Alaska, which makes it different than Fort Bragg, Fort Campbell, Fort Hood, Bliss, JBLM, which all have relatively the same training conditions, relatively the same in winter and summer. But it's not the case in Alaska. We're light and darkness. We're cold, extreme cold temperatures vary widely. The impacts of snow and ice and heat on muskeg, tundra, and permafrost impacts both mobility and survivability. That impacts both people and equipment. And additionally, wildfires, as you know, can fester over the winter in the duff layer and cause visibility issues and so forth that impact not only health, but training and visibility during the summer months. It's not enough to survive in extreme conditions. USARAC and Army forces in Alaska have to be operationally effective to be able to fight and win. Cold weather expertise is a requirement. It's not a luxury. This environment is compounded with Alaska's geographic location, so it results in tyranny of distance. And why is that important? Because just-in-time logistics can translate to risk of late to need. Time and distance in the Arctic take on a life all their own, as does the pace of operations. And in my opinion, if you can operate in the Arctic, you can operate anywhere, and our forces have proven that in Iraq and Afghanistan. From a manning perspective, it's important to build an Arctic ethos, a culture of cold weather excellence. To develop an Arctic ethos, that mindset culture, you need to live out in the environment to hold on to the belief that you can survive and fight in that environment and win. The secondary effects of the Arctic ethos is the ability to exercise discipline in all situations, as well as the requisite mental and physical toughness to operate there. Pete mentioned working with recruiting command. I would also suggest, engaging with universities and from cold weather climates that have ROTC programs. Probably find, as I did when I was CG, that there are many of the cadets that are about to graduate that have been to the Vermont school and actually have the Ram's Head device from the basic military mountaineering course. And so there's talent out there, both at basic AIT and through ROTC that can potentially support Arctic units. We need to look at ways to maintain extreme cold weather expertise, incentivize soldiers to enlist and to re-enlist to serve in Alaska, and offer the choice of back-to-back assignments to stabilize our personnel and their families to capitalize on that Arctic expertise. All back to, like I said, building a culture of Arctic excellence. From a training perspective, we need to surge. You can't surge relationships in a time of crisis. We need to expand partnerships and interoperability with our regional mission partners, and Pete mentioned several of them. Build collective expertise by, with, through our partners, and take advantage of the joint and combined training offered by exercises such as Arctic Edge, Northern Edge, Pete's Arctic Warrior, Red Flag, and so forth to build Arctic operational capability. We can, I believe, take a greater advantage of the Joint Pacific-Alaska Range Complex. Pete mentioned that as well. Potentially connecting Tanana Flats with DTA and YTA, as he mentioned. And why is that important? I think to create a contiguous echelon above brigade, full spectrum, collective training capability within JPARC. Then upgrading the targetry in the scenario support to accommodate company to battalion level combined arms live fire, and also in the future electromagnetic spectrum operations as well. I also think the instrumented BCT level training piece is important because essentially we have the potential to conduct those combat training center rotations under Arctic conditions as well within JPARC. It's important we integrate the Alaska Army and Air National Guard and their capabilities. Their expertise and knowledge of the environment is invaluable. Pete mentioned the importance of leaner training and certification for non-commissioned officers. It's paramount prior to conducting individual and collective training under extreme conditions. Individual training is key to gaining and maintaining proficiency. Pete mentioned some of the courses, such as the indoctrination courses, operators courses, leaders courses, as well as the basic and advanced mountaineering courses offered at the Northern Warfare Training Center. Those are all critical to improving and increasing individual, leader, and collective readiness. Pete covered kind of the Arctic deployment cycle, and that's important. I tell you that the Northern Warfare Training Center in Black Rapids is essential to gaining readiness. The courses are incredibly valuable. The command can also leverage the regional cold weather and climbing expertise found in India, Nepal, Japan, and Norway, to mention a few, not to mention other European countries such as Finland and Sweden. We can also leverage the Marine Corps' Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport, as well as the Ranger Training Brigade and the school in Jericho, Vermont, not only for cross-leveling of expertise, but for instructor exchanges as well. And also there's a real valuable resource that's still in the state, USARAC alumni, and then tying into those civilian instructors from the skiing and the climbing community that can help both NWTC and units increase proficiency. The training standards, I think Pete mentioned this, we have to review them for Arctic conditions. As many of you know, conducting a platoon attack coming off strikers and snowshoes in 3 feet of snow at -25, as well as assembling off a drop zone in similar conditions in February, is a lot different than in July. Physical fitness training is at a premium from a cold weather training perspective, skiing, snowshoeing, a biathlon and climbing perspective, and there are different extreme core demands placed on the body, as well as nutritional demands. From an equipped perspective, Pete covered that. USARAC lacks the mobility that's effective under winter and summer conditions, and they'll get after that piece. It's about all season mobility as well, not just for winter, snow and ice. And Pete mentioned, I think he mentioned the ATVs with larger tires or more than 4 wheels that can be switched out for tracks in the winter, the track squad vehicles, snow machines, and so forth. But critical to that too is also training our mechanics to be able to maintain it. And from past experience, I think it's important that when we write contracts for that kind of equipment, that we do it in such a way as to allow for innovation by our soldiers for environmental conditions that don't, in a way that doesn't nullify warranties. Just through use and experience, we're going to come up with better ways to operate. We need to be able to modify gear as needed. The temperature variations have a significant impact on metal. Weapons, indirect fire systems, tool sets and equipment, C4 ISR, vehicles, batteries, and so forth. We need to ensure that our MTOs account for those requirements and that what the units have what they need to operate effectively and safely. and the OCIE, excuse me, organizations, clothing and equipment and so forth needs to be modernized and kept up to date based on the requirements. And one of the things we need to push to is ensuring that the engineers and the designers actually come to the environment under those harsh conditions to work with soldiers, essentially soldiers over their shoulder, in the loop, human factors engineering to design gear that can be operated at -40 with Arctic mittens. Communications are notoriously challenging. Pete's command will address that piece as well. We just need to make sure that our equipment is survivable and resilient under those conditions. We need to address power generation, not only from a battery perspective, but from a generator perspective. And that impacts things such as tactical operations centers, medical facilities in the field, combat vehicles, aviation, and so forth. And as you can imagine, if you have to leave that gear running at night, then you have a fuel supply distribution challenge as well. Under organized, Arctic's unique in one way in that it's the northern approach to the homeland. It's also the western flank of NATO. It's a domain where 3 geographic commands come together, as well as DHS. And you can make a case that multiple functional commands come together as well. So the future command and controls constructs need to reflect that reality, as well as unit organizations and MTOs and so forth. I think in closing, it's important to establish relationships with academia. You've got 2 great schools with UAF and UAA. You've got private industry with experience up on the North Slope that can assist as well. And you've got the Arctic Domain Awareness Center. USARAC won't operate in a vacuum, so it can look to operate with the joint interagency and intergovernmental multinational piece. Pete mentioned Jim. We can look at, I think the Army should look at tying Arctic Warrior, Arctic Edge, and other exercise potentially into project convergence with regard to tech demos and experiments. I think there's opportunity there. And lastly, the Army during World War II had a close relationship with the indigenous people of Alaska, then referred to as Alaska Territorial Guard, also known as Eskimo Scouts. Teaming with Alaska Natives in the future should be a consideration as part of gaining Arctic domain awareness and sharing Arctic field craft as well. And so Mike and Church, that kind of wraps up my comments. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today.
Gerald Shields, another tour de force. I think you were once upon a time a former U.S. Army Alaska commander. It certainly reflects in the amount of scholarship you put into presenting these reflections. Simply outstanding. And I look forward to pulling the threads further with you, sir, during the Q&A session. And there's definitely some questions coming in that you'll be really superb to address. So thank you for this gift of your insight and wisdom. Let me give the floor back to Dr. Shrega, but don't go away, General Shields. We got more coming for you. Dr. Schrager, sir, I'd like to give you the floor back for our next speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Church. General Shields, thank you very much. I echo Church's comments. Let me remind individuals that are watching to send in their questions at polar@wilsoncenter.org. Thank you very much. Now it's a pleasure to welcome retired Lieutenant General Burt Garrett, who served as the former Deputy Commander of the United States European Command. General, the virtual floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike. It's a great pleasure to be here today and appreciate the effort that's gone into organizing this forum. I'd like to offer a little context and then toss in a couple of recommendations to help ease the way for JP and our Army strategists as they come to grips with this challenge ahead of them. First, a word on strategic context. For the Department of Defense and the Army, we don't get to pick our context. We have to deal with the world as it is. And that means preparing for great power competition with China and to a lesser extent with Russia. The Arctic region is an extension of that competition, even as the security environment in the Arctic is being fundamentally altered by the impact of climate change. Point is, you don't get to pick your context. That context is now unequivocally given to us, and we have to think and act accordingly. Now, speaking of context, DoD's strategic approach to the Arctic clearly focuses the military departments on implementing 3 ways to get to the desired end state. First is building Arctic awareness, and that's the whole Arctic, not just the North American Arctic, which we've primarily been focused on to this point in our discussions. Second, enhancing Arctic operations, which Mike Shields talked about in quite a bit of detail. And then lastly, strengthening the rules-based order in the Arctic. So the big question for Army strategists is a how question. How to craft a supporting strategy that helps ensure the Arctic is a secure and stable region where U.S. national interests are safeguarded, the U.S. homeland is defended, and nations work cooperatively to address shared challenges. Answering that question will require the Army to get comfortable with being a supporting service for the joint force. Given the Arctic's vast distances and challenges to land operations, the ability to project power forward is primarily going to be air and naval power together with space and cyber. And for the first time in decades, land will not be the most critical domain of warfare, and it may not even be the most decisive one. As a force organized, trained, and equipped for land warfare, the Army must adapt and change to be relevant in the Arctic. And doing so successfully will require the Army to relook program and budget priorities, as well as doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership, and education, personnel, and of course, facilities. Now, of course, that effort needs to be strategy driven, which underscores the importance of our work today to help bring the Army's Arctic strategy to life. And here are just a couple of recommendations that might help ease the way. First is the idea of radical collaboration. As the Army develops its Arctic strategy, the best approach might be to adopt the simple mantra of be a good teammate. That's a powerful antidote to inter-service rivalry. It rejects a zero-sum attitude, and it inspires the necessary collaboration and service to the mission. It also emphasizes the importance of strengthening alliances to face challenges from China and Russia and to deal with transnational threats like climate change. And to that end, the Army would be well served by pursuing a deeply inclusive approach in crafting its Arctic strategy. So cast a wide net and pull in all the combatant commands, geographic and functional, the other military departments, our NATO allies and our non-NATO partners, including both Arctic nations and like-minded non-Arctic nations. There's also a large number of interested organizations in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, as well as indigenous people and groups, which all have to be pulled in. Pull all of this in, and then use the strategy to build bridges rather than walls. Again, be a good teammate. Second point is the idea of flexible response. Military deterrence in the Arctic requires the Army to flexibly project power into the region as part of the joint force. To meet that requirement, the Army must regain its ability to operate effectively in an Arctic environment. And I said before, the whole Arctic, not just the North American Arctic. And they've got to do this, our Army has got to do this in a strategy-driven and resource-informed way. Success requires adapting existing capabilities and, where necessary, selectively acquiring new capabilities combined with Arctic-specific training, exercises, and posture refinements. The good news is the Army already has the ability to perform multi-domain operations in the Arctic, from space to mud. And here's a few of the most important capabilities. Aerial ISR for domain awareness, long-range precision fires, long-range vertical lift, integrated air and missile defense, Army cyber capabilities, Army space capabilities. And just a reminder, the Army is the largest user of space. And then, of course, logistics and sustainment, especially the Army Prepositioned Stock Program, APS, which may have to be reoriented a bit to ensure we can sustain Arctic operations. But all of these multi-domain capabilities are resident today in our active Army, Army National Guard, and Army Reserve. Key to success is bringing these capabilities online in the Arctic region, even as the Army continues to support globally integrated operations by the Joint Force. So that's it. Let me wrap this up with what might be the end result of our effort today. And Church, you asked about a kind of a desired outcome. I would say the desired outcome might be a common vision and sense of unified purpose as the Army moves from crafting to executing its Arctic strategy. And I'm fully confident that JP and the Army strategist team there can bring all that to life. So thanks very much.
General Garrett, thank you. That's exceptional. We'll pull some thoughts forward, common vision, unified purpose. It is, from my vantage point, a privilege to move that strategic conversation to our next speaker, who's representing General Dan Hokanson, the Chief of the National Guard Bureau. This is Major General Randolph Staudenraus, who serves as General Hokanson's J5 at the National Guard Bureau. General Staudenraus, I give you the floor.
Thank you. And on behalf of General Hokanson, the Chief National Guard Bureau, I'd like to thank the Wilson Center and the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, and especially Mike and Church. I know he's tied to you pretty close, Church, so I appreciate it. And again, you guys are setting up another terrific and amazing forum. As we discussed the Army's Arctic strategy and how it nests within the National Defense Strategy, we're really looking at a whole of government, and that's been mentioned a couple times, or even really this one is a whole of society, because when you look at the Arctic domain and not just the Alaska part of that, but the Arctic domain, you are definitely in the whole of society. So looking at this today, I just want to tell the audience and the panel a little bit about the National Guard and where we are with this. So the National Guard is the primary operational reserve of the Army and the Air Force. And as the National Guard, we represent the Army and the Air Force as a citizen, in a state, as a state employee, so in a state active duty, and also in a federal status. We are well nested within, as Colonel Clark was saying, as he's building the strategy, we are well nested within that strategy. And I want to kind of put some highlights on that as we do that. We're definitely part of the Joint Force, and that's kind of our Title 10 role here. So in the detection and the kinetic capability, defeating ballistic missiles, okay, working for Army Alaska Command there. And also we were really heavy into the Joint Force projection. So we have the tankers up at Eielson. We have a lot of the lift down at, down at Elmerdorf. So we are in the fight every day along with the BCTs that the Army National Guard brings. One of the things that the folks really don't know about the National Guard is the allies and partners piece. And that was really discussed a lot. I think General Garrett just said it, with like-minded non-Arctic nations. So we do have some of those, with Alaska being a state partnership program, which is a National Guard program, and they are aligned with Mongolia. Okay, not an Arctic nation, but fairly close. The terrain and everything is fairly close to that. So with that expertise there, they're bringing what they know about the Arctic to Mongolia, who is now going, yes, I see the U.S. perspective and the norms which we're trying to bring to the Arctic domain. Other relationships we have along with that is New York, and they're with Denmark and also with New Zealand, and they bring the LC-130s. So you're talking the C-130s with skis, and they do that every year. And so they're bringing that expertise and also, again, that knowledge of the Arctic and what the U.S. perspective is of that. Another one is a relationship with Maine and Norway. Again, already talked about a couple times. Norway is an important partner in this, an Arctic nation, and so how do we make sure we're tied to them? Another thing that gone along with that SBP partners is there's the National Guard Arctic Interest Council. And this is made up of 15 states from the northern tier states. And what this is, it's not, okay, yeah, they're not on the Arctic thing. They go out and they're with 22 different partner nations that are non-Arctic members. And so when they go out and they talk to their relationships there, they're talking to these other countries about the U.S. and what their thoughts are on the Arctic domain and what it means for the rules and the governance of the Arctic. And so those countries come back to us and go, we would like to be part of that discussion. And so again, as General Garrett said, like-minded non-Arctic nations, this is how we're bringing them on board. And that's definitely also going to be written into the Army's strategy. I'd also like to get into more specifics, and General Shields brought this up of where we are trying to get back out into the nations. And so I know General Adiak works with Major General Sachs, who's the Adjutant General of the Alaska National Guard. And I talked to him, and his big push right now, it's called rural operations. So during World War II and the Cold War, we had 90 or 83 sites that we had people at. And that was, like we said, how do we get back into the domain so we have the expertise of every place in the Alaska Arctic? We don't have that anymore. But what he's gone back and set up is 19 sites. He's setting up 9 regional sites that he's going to use state manning to man. So you put 15 or so Army National Guard folks in there. And then he's taken the Air National Guard, now that you have those sites, and he's putting the Air National Guard back into training on a state status and flying back into these sites that some have never been flown into before. So trying to bring that expertise back, as everybody's been talking to, how do we get back in there and do daily operations on that? So what does that do for us? That's going to conduct training on the Air National Guard side. So we have a little bit of CBRNE capability, taking that back out to these sites. But also, as General Adiak was talking about getting back in and doing his exercises in February. Well, if we are already there, and so if we're going to be the permanent party as the Alaska National Guard, we have to have the permanent presence. And so now we can help out the federal forces in that exercise. And that's where we really need to be. And this is also in line with Indo-PACOM's Agile Combat Deployment policies that he's trying to put. So along with helping out with, of course, Northcom's Arctic Eagle, Arctic Edge, all those bigger exercises, of course, we're going to be part of that. So just kind of an overview of the National Guard and what we're doing in there, but well said by all the speakers part of me. And so thanks for letting me be part of this forum and look forward to the discussion. Thank you, sir.
General, thank you. And an important component of this discussion, we remember well the National Guard Arctic Interest Group. We hosted that entire effort at the Wilson Center and thought it was cutting edge then, timely then, even more timely now. But relative to this discussion, I think you've highlighted a number of issues that are integral to the overall effort. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to following up as well. Now it's a pleasure to welcome Brigadier General Patrick Carpentier of the Canadian Armed Forces. He serves as the commander of Joint Task Force North from Yellowknife Northwest Territory. General, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, good. All right. Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially with this group of folks. It brings back a lot of memories of my time in Alaska. And I have to thank the U.S. Air Force. Most of my experience in the North has been through the U.S. Air Force with both in Greenland and Anchorage, Alaska. So this is actually my first tour in the Canadian Arctic, and really enjoying it. But most of my experience comes from the U.S. Air Force. I'll keep my remarks fairly short, but what I'd like to highlight is 4 limitations that I see in trying to get to true Arctic operations. And the number one thing that I see that limits our ability to do things in the Arctic, not so much away from home, but here in the North American Arctic, is that we are Western militaries, both Western militaries of first world nations. So what I mean by that is that the authorities that we have, we know how to operate when we're away from home, but when it comes to domestic operations, we have limitations placed on us by Posse Comitatus, by the National Defense Act, that put us in a place where we have to think about operations a little bit different. So as we develop strategies and things that we need to do for the Arctic, we have to look at the authorities that we have and really think of the problem set in a whole of government, whole of nation, whole of society standpoint. So that's been mentioned prior, but I think it's a building block that we have to look at in everything that we do. The second challenge that I see is, and it's the same in other parts of the world, but we are in a space where it's not enough to look at kinetic, the kinetic fight. We have to look at the evolving domains of competition. And in those evolving domains of competition, the one that I see that is the one that we have to get after or start understanding the most is the information domain. If you look at the North American Arctic in particular, 700,000 people in Alaska, about 115,000 in Canada's Arctic, and about 40,000 in Greenland. So less than 1 million people in all of the North American Arctic. Small communities dispersed over vast distances, and that have a lack of resources, lack of services, lack of communications. There's very few communities that have all the services that we would enjoy down south. So that puts them at risk of being exploited by different entities that would come in and provide services or want to take advantage of or create dependencies in the north. So we have to be aware of that. The third area is the physical realities of the north. So if I think I had a graphic there that I wanted to put up, if you can put that up.
Yep, we'll work on that. I think Michaela's working on that. There you go.
All right. So the JTFN AOR, that's the part of Canada that's north of 60, extends to the pole, goes from the Alaska border over to the international border between Canada and Greenland. So the area, and then on the right you see the area overlaid on the continental U.S. And then Afghanistan on top of that. So if you look at that space and the area that we really have to project over, it's an incredibly huge area with a very, very sparse population. Basically no supply chains. There's no rail line that goes from North America into Alaska. There's very few ports. Much of the maritime approaches in the far north are not accessible through the winter months because of ice. So when you look at lines of communication, terrestrial lines of communication, there's very few. There's a few airports, but very few logistic stores that are projected in the north. So from we have ability to project. Sustaining is a different problem. So if you start looking at Patriot batteries with no rail lines to feed them, that's an issue. So there's several issues that we need to address from a North American standpoint that we haven't really. We started looking at the issue, but we're not there yet. There's a lot of work to be done. And then the final issue that I'd like to bring up is the cognitive limitations of our experiences. So if you look at Afghanistan, for those of us that have fought there, was a huge logistical challenge. When you overlay Afghanistan on the North American Arctic, there was roads and airports in Afghanistan and supply depots that we could get in there with. The North American Arctic is not that well equipped. So the experiences that we've had elsewhere don't translate very well to the challenges that we have in the North American Arctic. And with that, sir, I'll end my comments and look forward to questions.
General, thank you very, very much. You hit on, we'll come back. I know I keep saying this, but we will come back to some Q&A and follow-up themes, but particularly, again, here in Alaska, reconfiguring in our mind the North American Arctic, what I've been calling these zones of cooperation and zones of partnership, these arcs of partnership, these arcs of security. Alaska, Canada, Greenland, Iceland, that arc, and thinking about the north, east to west, west to east versus north to south, south to north. So I really appreciate that, and how infrastructure can enable or inhibit, lack thereof inhibit. So I want to come back to those just as a point, Church, for later on follow-up, but thank you very much. Church, back to you.
Thank you very much. And Pat, thank you for the reflections. We're going to pivot now from a conversation led by our allies, our closest allies in the Arctic, to that of a policy perspective, and now has a great opportunity to bring to the stage former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for NATO and European Affairs, my very good friend Jim Townsend, who serves as Global Fellow at the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center. Dasty Townsend, Emeritus. Jim, I gave you the floor.
Thank you, Church, and thank all of you. This has been a wonderful discussion, and it reminds me of 2 or 3 others that we've had in Alaska with other services. We had one with the Navy, and there are a lot of similar issues are being discussed about getting up to speed on operating in the Arctic. So what I bring to this is the Nordic side. This was alluded to by a couple of our speakers. General Garrett was one. And Church, of course, coming out of UCOM, you and I know very well the European Arctic and our experience up there. So just a couple of points, and then I'm going to pass it back to you, Church. The first one is that there is a lot that we can gain, that the Army can gain from talking to our allies and partners from the Nordic countries. Denmark, of course, Norway, Sweden, Finland. I've been up there in their part of the Arctic for years. I've watched their armies operate up there. I've watched their technology up there, their equipment. They're going through a lot of strengthening and building their capabilities as well. The Swedes have increased their defense spending each year by huge amounts. And so what I am gonna just ask is certainly as the Army has looked at its equipment challenges, clothing, vehicles, you've talked quite a bit about it. Certainly in that part of the European Arctic, if you talk to the Norwegian Army or the Finnish Army, I think they probably have broken the code, if you will, on operating in that Arctic kind of environment. I know how difficult it is to buy from overseas. I was involved in foreign military sales, and I've been 35 years in the Pentagon, so I know how it is. But I think it was the chief who said, get over to Europe, get to UCOM, talk to the guys over there, see what's going on. I want to foot stomp that. You know, Church, we had a conference a year and a half ago, it seems like another age, where we brought the attachés, the Nordic attachés over, if you remember. And at the very end of that conference, as we were getting ready to go home, they were the last to speak. And I think they knocked everyone's socks off talking about what they were doing up there in terms of operations in the Arctic. So I just want to really foot stomp that point about talking to and looking at the equipment and the types of things that they have so that we're not starting over. Obviously, and a lot of the speakers have talked about what is already resident in the Army in terms of capability. It's a matter of gathering it together. But I really do believe that we could get a jump start in terms of equipment and that type of thing by seeing what they have over there. And let me just throw out too, as you all know, the Marines have been exercising in North Norway, large numbers over the past couple of years. So certainly a trip to UCOM and talking to not just our guys there in Stuttgart and the Marines as well, but also going up there to the Nordic countries and seeing what they're doing. I've done that year after year after year. It's worth a trip over there and seeing what we can do just off the shelf to help to fill some gaps. You know, I haven't heard the word resilience yet. At least I don't think I have. Resilience is a big buzzword in NATO and in Europe as we talk about dealing with the Russians, trying to improve allied resilience to a lot of the gray area combat that we're underway right now up in Europe as we deal with the Russians. And resilience is kind of it's kind of the tag word that we sweep everything under. How resilient is society to deal with what the Russians are doing, as well as to deal with outside shock? I think as I listen to everyone talking today, certainly in Alaska, there's a resilience mission as well. We all know how special Alaska is. Particularly our last speaker was talking about the logistics challenges and this type of thing. If we find ourselves in a conflict of some type in the Alaska region, in the Arctic region around Alaska that we've been focusing on, there's going to be a resilience mission there, a resilience issue for the indigenous people, but the Alaskan society as they get hit with a cyber attack, or we get hit with other things that are going to happen there. Whether it's misinformation or other things. But if you look at the Army and the Army mission in Alaska, I think part of it is going to have to be resilience, aiding the Alaskan society to become more resilient to a gray area conflict. I know the Alaska National Guard, that certainly is what the Alaska National Guard, that's its first mission. But I think the Army itself, as you look at the missions the U.S. Army may be needing to prepare for, we've been talking about operating in terms of combat and this type of thing in an Arctic environment. There's a resilience mission there too, because all eyes are going to turn to the Army to try to help the Alaskan society deal with the problems that might come from a cyber attack. I can tell you a cyber attack in Washington would be chaos. I can just imagine how it could be in Alaska. Maybe it's not as much chaos. I don't know. But I think we got to think resilience when we think of Alaska, as much as we think about it when we think about European allies and how they would deal with a gray area problem with the Russians. I think it's an Alaskan thing as well. So I wanted to make those points, and Church, I'll pass the baton back to you.
Jim, thank you. One reflection on that, exceptional. I would say that we, of course, have a deep interest in the Alaskan part of the Arctic, but it is one part of an over pan-Arctic aspect. And so we have perhaps regions of responsibility, sovereign territory, the regions of interest, which is pan-Arctic. Mike, back to you.
Yeah, Jim, thank you very much for that and for bringing up the issue of resilience across the board. I do want to revisit this again. It's exceptionally complementary thoughts, Jim, to the rest of these discussions. And in the spirit of that, now it's a pleasure to introduce our friend and colleague, Ms. Iris Ferguson, who serves as a senior advisor and the Arctic advisor for the Department of the U.S. Air Force's Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategy, Integration, and Requirements. And as many of you know, Iris helped to lead the Air Force's Arctic strategy. Iris, I turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Mike. As Mike just said, I was the primary architect of the Air Force's Arctic strategy, so completely empathize and appreciate the challenge of the Army trying to wrap their arms around all that they're doing in the region to try to articulate both the strengths that they have and also talk through some of the challenges of preparing for the future. So when the Air Force released its strategy back in July, we tried to do that. We had 4 lines of effort, bridging off of the national defense strategy and its focus on homeland defense. We had the first priority as domain vigilance, and then our second priority is power projection, building off of the incredible geographic location of the Arctic and our assets there. And also our third priority of allies and partners, how we can help amplify and build off of the incredible opportunity that it is to have really capable allies in the region. And then fourthly, it's the last line of effort was preparation. So trying to both, knit together all the different things that a service is doing in the region, and also trying to look at the different operational challenges and tactical challenges and how it fits into a strategic narrative is no small undertaking. So I completely appreciate where you all are. And, back in 2017, we put together a delegation of Air Force leadership to go visit Alaska, Canada, and Greenland to really walk the ground to understand all that we were doing in the region and look at what the changes that were taking place on the ground. And as a part of that, we actually spent a lot of time looking at a lot of the Army capabilities that we were looking to leverage as part of our strategy. So when we were in Alaska, we were talking about missile defense and that domain vigilance. We visited Fort Greely and the ground-based interceptors that kind of feed into the missile defense architecture. When we're talking about adapting to the changes in the environment and climate change, we spent a bit of time talking to CREL, the Cold Regions Research Lab folks that look at permafrost challenges. And as we're even today, with F-35s going into Eielson, there's some significant challenges with infrastructure built and hydrology challenges. So working very closely hand in hand with our Army partners there. And then one of the cooler assets that we visited was the Cold Regions Test Center, which effectively is a region in Alaska where you can, the Army has incredible capabilities to test equipment at -50, -60 degrees. And one of those is this chamber actually, where, you know, if you, there's nothing like seeing a 4-star general trying to turn on a flashlight with a huge glove in this, you know, -50 chamber for him to recognize that this is not a insignificant challenge, that there are real necessities to preparation for being able to operate in the region. So, and that's obviously what these strategies are about. It's about trying to prepare for the future and articulate how we need to, you know, look towards the next steps forward. And, you know, just very briefly before, you know, passing this on, you know, the 2 hardest things I think for the Air Force were where trying to figure out where the Arctic fits. This has been alluded to before, you know, all the different combatant commands, both geographic and functional commands. And, you know, when the scenario is messy, you have to build a big tent. So, you know, we're taking a very broad approach to how we're working together with all the partners, NORTHCOM, PACOM, EUCOM, STRATCOM, SpaceCom, Cyber, all the different geographic and functional commands that fit into this region. And it makes it really challenging for implementation. So you have to build a big tent to communicate to all of them, and obviously the joint partners as well. So really, as we're working to implement this, we're really looking forward to working closely with our joint partners. And then the second hardest thing is determining the prioritization with implementation. You know, it's one thing to write words down on a piece of paper and have platitudes, and there's lots of strategies that do that. And I appreciate the Army's attempt at really getting after some of these challenges in a tactical way. But the prioritization is really challenging. We cannot do it all. Resources are finite. It's a reality. And so, you know, we're working on, as we move forward, we're implementing our strategy in various ways. We're looking at the training aspects. And General Andrusiak talked about how the Army is working to codify its Arctic expertise. We're looking to do the same thing from the Air Force perspective. How do you code that someone has experience in preparation for the Arctic, so that if, you know, unfortunate humanitarian assistance and disaster response event happens, you have someone to call. So talent management is a big piece of this. You know, missile defense, we're looking at the advanced battle space management system, which is effectively new technology for sensors that can help us in deploying it to the northern tier. So trying to have this new technology help us with our missile defense challenges that have long existed with the North Warning System. And so really excited about the Army coming out with this strategy, certainly needing and wanting to highlight and leverage one another's capabilities as we move forward jointly. You know, certainly, you know, if I could highlight 3 things: communications, to building a common operating picture, and joint training. I think if we can work together on those 3 areas, at least we'll be leaps and bounds ahead of where we were before these strategies came out. And to use General Garrett's phrase, the Air Force is into radical collaboration, and we hope to, you know, do that with you as you all roll this out. Thanks very much.
So Aris, thank you. I was just going to say, what you described to me was radical collaboration. So and growing a big tent, I think, is an exceptional perspective to maintain. Thank you for those reflections, for your leadership in developing the Air Force Arctic strategy, and sharing those perspectives for our Army colleagues. It's now my privilege to bring to the table the Ms. Sherry Goodman, the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense and Senior Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, Polar Institute, and also the Environmental Change and Security Program. Sherry, I give the floor to you for your batting up cleanup before we go to questions, so bring it home.
Okay, thank you very much, Church and Mike, and thanks to all my fellow colleagues and panelists. I'm really, really impressed with the work that is going on. And when I think back, I've been working across the Arctic for 25 years now. And when I was Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, the name of the game was how rapidly could we clean up the mess that we had left during the Cold War throughout both Alaska, which is why Senator Stevens created the DoD Environmental Restoration Program. It was really to clean up barrel drums and other sites across Alaska. And then we were collaborating with the Russians and the Norwegians and Canadians in a program called Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation, during which I brought delegation of Russians and Norwegians into Alaska to see how we work together. So into Galena and Richardson and Elmendorf. So that, of course, was a different era. And now we're in the climate era. But I want to say I'm so impressed by the radical collaboration and the openness that's already occurring. The fact that we're having this discussion, a public discussion about building a service strategy to operate in a region is really remarkable. And so I want to give the Army and all of you really credit for doing this, because it is part of the engagement and outreach strategy. And I think that's really, really important. Clearly, there's a lot going on. Anyone who says that the US and the Army in particular is not already upping our game in the Arctic, as Secretary Mattis called for a couple of years ago, doesn't know what's going on. So that also is important. So when we talk about, the destabilizing forces in the Arctic, it's both the fact that we have increased Russian, Chinese, and other presence and competition throughout the region, but it's also the destabilizing changes in the climate. And that, I think, is important. We know that, but I think it's going to be going to become more important because the Arctic, of course, is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. The permafrost is now unstable in a variety of places. We have yet to learn, I think, the full extent of the infrastructure damage suffered in Russia throughout this summer of temperatures up to 100 degrees. And that's going to have consequences across the whole of the Arctic. And as we think about how to increase and improve our capabilities to operate in the Arctic, we're going to have to build in the fact that all the conditions are less predictable than they've been in the past. And in that regard, I think, part of our upping our game is working with our allies and partners. And here, I think we're going to have so much openness and willingness to engage. And so one of the pieces of counsel I would have for the Army as we move in to a new administration, which is one of their watchwords, is, engage with allies and partners. You've already been doing that, but I think it gives you an even further impetus to take advantage of the opportunities to work with Norway, Sweden, Finland, our high north partners, Greenland, to see not only how they're operating, but to think about new ways of engaging through exercises and training and the education that they bring. And also the work that you're doing with the Alaska Natives. Of course, they are our eyes and ears there. They are part of developing this Arctic domain awareness. And I think that's going to be incredibly important. And as we look at the innovation, I love the emphasis on being able to allow the units to innovate down at the tactical edge, because you don't always know in Washington what's going on, and you can't always tell a contractor. So and that innovation capability at the unit level and at the soldier level, I think is going to be incredibly important. And I hope it will be championed. And that will occur, I think, also need to occur as we think about how we're going to continue to power our forces throughout the world, but especially in the Arctic, as we're going to move into an era where there's going to be a greater demand to decarbonize our forces. And DoD at some point is going to get aside some of those net zero goals as well. And so that, I think, is all coming. That is all coming in the future. And that leads to the point, I think, that Jim made about the resilience of operating in the region. I think is going to be another important watchword. And I want to also underscore the importance that I think the Army and the Guard will have to provide to local and first responders in either a homeland defense or defense support to civil authorities mission. Much like, I think, when you think about the kind of risks in the near-term risks in the Arctic over the next decade or so, some of them could be a search and rescue or an oil spill in the maritime domain, where our Coast Guard and first responders will need to be able to call on military maritime forces in order to support that search and rescue or that oil spill. And I think the same is now going to be, you could think of a comparable framework for Army operations needing to integrate. So I think this whole work, at some point, obviously, we will have to resolve that AOR issue. And I'm I'm very happy that you're all kind of working without feeling recognizing the seams of that, but also working to be able to increase our capability. And I think when we get to the point that we can adjust those issues to enable a more seamless set of Arctic capabilities, you all will have done so much good work and will all be, as a nation, as the Army, a Department of Defense, and an interagency, much better for it. So thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here with you all today.
Sherry, Sherry, thank you very much. We often ask you to do a lot of things for us, and I think you just not only introduced very important issues for us to think about, but you absolutely tied this all together for us in a really nice, forward-thinking way. So thank you very much for all of that. Church has allowed me 2 very quick questions before I turn it to him, and then we'll try to get to some of these other questions. I do want to let you know that the great team we have in place at Wilson, John, Tracy, Trayon, thank you very much. You can't see them, they're behind the scenes, but they're going to spend another 15 minutes or so with us. So we're going to go over the allotted time for another 15 minutes. And if we need to, I might be able to nudge them on for another few more minutes, but they're nice enough to spend a little later time with us in DC. So we've got a little bit more time. So my first question, I have 2 questions, one for Colonel Clark, one for General Andresiak. Colonel Clark, thinking about the lessons we learned from history. I'm struck today, as I have been in the past, with the following. References to we're not prepared for fill in the blank, but we used to have capacity in fill in the blank. So I'm thinking about, World War II, pre-World War II, when that hit, the United States Quartermaster Corps, that was a scramble to get us equipment, everything from what kind of boots to wear in real time to the mountaineering issues that General Shields brought up. And then we see it again in the Korea War, and we see it again in mountain warfare and the war on terror. We continue to go. So the question really boils down to this. To what degree are you using lessons learned from history to inform what you're doing today as you prepare to build this strategy for tomorrow?
Oh, thank you for that question. It's a very apt one. And as General Key had pointed out, I actually have a background in history. So that was what the first, as does actually General Garrick, who's also a PhD in history. And so we instinctively turned to the Center for Military History, and then also the Army Heritage and Education Center, and had them develop a couple of pieces for us, looking at various aspects of this problem. One is what is the Army's history in terms of specialized environmental units, just writ large, and managing the tensions between generalized needing generalized capacity to put towards any problem, and having specialized. Another question we had them look at, which General Andresiak had really gone through very in depth, what he's doing in the present, is how do you build expertise in a new environment. And the thing that has struck us, and this was kind of hinted at with a couple of the various speakers, is this is a really good skill for the U.S. Army to have, just writ large. Certainly we need to be able to regain our Arctic expertise, but the exact same methodology of training leaders that he laid out in terms of the several tiers of individual training, going out and building collective unit expertise, that could be applied to a lot of different environments as well. Urban terrain, jungle, and actually General Flynn, our Army G3, has drawn on some of his time in the Pacific in terms of just going back towards the jungle training that we had lost. So this is a great skill for us to codify, so we don't have to do it kind of as you alluded to, spending blood and treasure in the most difficult way. I think that one of the more profound ways, and this is the difference between the old mobilization armies of World War I, World War II, Korea and Vietnam. So at some point we were a little bit careless, and we just kind of threw a lot of mass at it. With the all volunteer force, and the expense of the modern joint force, we don't have that luxury. And with the Chiefs people strategy, we're trying to be much more deliberate about knowing what individual soldiers, what their knowledge, skills, and attributes are. And you can imagine that that will be incredibly important, that we can very quickly say, you know, who out there in the force knows a lot about the Arctic, has participated in events, and then we can help use them to plus up more units when, as you know, as you led into, we're wrong in predicting the future, and we suddenly have to very quickly train units up or leaven them with a lot of expertise. We think that that this will be some good reps for us to do it in peacetime, so that it will be easier if we have to do it in extremis. So thank you for the question.
Thank you for the answer. It's good to hear. General Andrziak, there are a number of questions that have come in all along a similar line, and the following is this. I'm condensing this now. How do you specifically plan to work with Alaska's Department of Public Safety to advance the strategies and the training going forward that you have spoken to?
Yeah, Mike, that's one that we probably need to do some work on. I mean, there is a degree of that already happens, right? So there's a rescue coordination center here. We already participate in things that happen in this particular environment where we got to send out aircraft, in some cases soldiers, to go out and work with the public safety professionals. So there's a framework for that already exists. This is another tie-in with the Guard here, where we can learn a couple of things, work with Tory Sachs, and figure out how we got to expand upon it. Because the reality is, we're talking homeland defense as an aspect of this. We have a DISCA mission here, for defense support to civil authorities, if there's a natural disaster that happens here, we got to be able to get in and through the environment. And so we got to continue to forge those relationships and be able to operate if we're asked to support the state. So I think we have a good framework. It's one that we got to grow and expand upon.
Thank you. Church, I'll leave it to you.
I had the privilege of asking the next question here, and this is one I'm going to loft up to General Garrett. I'm going to ask you for your reflections on this one. As you looked at the example of radical collaboration, or as you brought up the term radical collaboration, do you have some examples or some illustrations that perhaps we could be helpful for the Army planners to think through, and some examples or maybe use cases that would perhaps illustrate a way to apply radical collaboration to developing an Arctic strategy?
Yeah, the idea of radical collaboration comes from a book written by General Dempsey and Ori Kaufman entitled Radical Inclusion. And I would recommend that as probably a start point. It's a quick read, but it gets the point across that given the speed and velocity of change right now in the world, the importance of casting a wide net to get a bunch of diverse ideas, recognizing that change is constant, but if we can just get the right people, the right ideas in the room, we can build out a strategy that might last longer than one budget cycle, if you will. In terms of examples, I can just share examples from combat in Iraq or Afghanistan, or across Africa when I was the commander of U.S. Army Africa, where you took disparate groups and people and put them in a room. And it's always the people on the back bench that have the key idea that you need. And the task for a leader is to be able to pull that idea out and put a spotlight on it. And if it works and helps, then drive that idea into the strategy. So that, I guess, in a nutshell would be it. It's just the importance of inclusion in what we're doing. The default setting, I know when I was an Army planner, the default setting was to grab the people I knew best, put them around me in the skiff, and nug out, an op plan or an op order or whatever it was. That was the wrong approach in retrospect. And we need to be a little more patient and take the time, again, to get the right people and the right ideas, more importantly, in the room for decision makers. Hope that helps a little bit.
Simply outstanding. General Garrett, thank you for that. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask one more question, then give the floor back to Mike for the next one to follow. And this is for our good friend, the commander of Joint Task Force North in Yellowknife. General, as you look at your battle, your tactical formations there, and the crisis planning that you're perhaps challenged to conduct with on behalf of the Canadian Armed Forces and really on behalf of the government of Canada, what are some illustrations that you would like to have perhaps offer to help through thinking high north from a Canadian perspective that could help form some perspectives for the Army, U.S. Army Arctic strategy? Some of those key lessons, key insights. As an example, the Canadian Ranger program has been a superb example for helping to provide Indigenous knowledge into the ranks. Building out on that, or perhaps some other ideas, I'd give the floor to you for your reflections, General.
Thanks, General Key. So from a Joint Task Force North perspective, hang on just a second, let me turn that down. From a Canadian Forces perspective and a Joint Task Force North perspective, the real advantage that we have here is that I'm strictly force employment. So I don't have any assigned forces. So everything that we do is based on partnerships. And so from Alaska to Greenland, General Shields and I were in Alaska. We built the first one of the common operating picture that we used in Alaska to interact with the different interagency partners. I'm happy to report that we now received that COP in JTFN, and we share our COP with Alaska, and the same on BICES with our NATO partner in Greenland. So from a common operating picture, we can see all of the North American Arctic, and those are partnerships. It's a result of personal relationships that wouldn't otherwise happen, without people interacting. So Mr. Townsend talked about resilience earlier, and the reality is that sometimes less really is more. And in the North, the reality that no one has all the resources that they need is a fact of life for everyone. And so people come together to make things happen. So the Rangers are a great example of that. The level of situational awareness that we derive through our partners in each of the communities. We have a Ranger patrol in most of the northern communities. And those patrols are, we consider them reservists, but they're actually community members that are experts on the land in the area that they come from. And the one thing that we didn't talk to too much today is the diversity of landscape. The Arctic is not the same everywhere. Most of the Arctic that we know, Alaska and in the western part of the Arctic, is below the tree line. The eastern Arctic is completely above the tree line. And that is a much different, harsher environment than we know in the West. And so the relationship that we have with people that live in those areas is critical to our ability to be able to do things throughout the Arctic, because the skills that are required in particular areas change based on the location of that community or that area. So everything that we do is based on relationships. So it's really core to all the success that we've had.
Thank you, General. Church, I've got I have a number of questions about infrastructure, and I'm going to try to condense them, likely to General Andresiak first, and then maybe Colonel Clark and maybe General Carpentier, you may want to weigh in as well. It boils down to this: to what degree does infrastructure play into your planning? In Alaska, certainly there's lots of discussion about a port or a series of ports, mining roads that can be leveraged for both civil and other uses, expansion of rails. railroad in the state of Alaska, the introduction of fiber optics and other broadband capabilities, which is always a big issue throughout the North. So to what degree does the need for or support for infrastructure come into play in your planning? And maybe General Andresiak, I can go to you first, maybe Colonel Clark second, and General Carpentier, because we're so linked, maybe for your thoughts, and then open it up to the panel as well for reactions. General Andresiak?
Mike, that's a great question, because we're heavily reliant on infrastructure, and there is limited infrastructure. So there needs what infrastructure that gets invested in. There needs to be a hard look at that piece of it. A lot of what we're doing right now is trying to figure out how to operate without it, because we got to start with that approach as well. As you look at even the investment in the force, as we start building out our readiness, there's a lot that we have that relies on some kind of infrastructure to keep it at a certain temperature so you can actually use it. So we're looking at, do we go back to a more simplified version so we can operate in the absence of infrastructure, but you can't build it out fast enough. But the reality that does take time, and that's a big piece of it. So from a multimodal standpoint, there's single points of failure in the state, and we got to figure out how to create some redundancy in that, if you want to call that resilience. And I think the larger strategy is looking at other ports and other areas, but that is largely driving our initial approach. If we got to be able to operate in and through in the absence of it in the near term, that's kind of what's driving some of our training requirements and some of our initial equipping requirements. But it is a huge factor that needs to be taken into consideration. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Colonel Clark.
Luckily, classification will keep me brief on this one, but there are a lot of exciting things that the Army can provide as part of the joint force. Some great, potential means of operations, but it's striking to what extent, and this is following on General Andresiak's point, that it's very easy to put icons on a map. We have to think through the infrastructure that actually supports those operations, those concepts of operation in a way that is far more extreme in the Arctic for all the reasons that have been laid out. So we absolutely are looking at it and trying to do those calculations, but that'll require much deeper study as we go forward.
General Carpentier, do you have comments on that?
Yeah, so from my standpoint, three priorities for infrastructure. Number one is communications. As you know, there's no SATCOMs north of 72 degrees. There is, but they're very sparse and hard to get to. So north of 72, I've got no comms. So if we're talking about polar operations, we need to fix that. There are solutions coming, but we're not there yet. So comms is my number one priority. Energy is the next one. So energy in the north, as you know, there's no existing electrical grids. All communities are heated by oil. So it's oil that's barged or flown into the communities. The reality of fuel consumption in the north is that it's 20 to 25 times. So whatever consumption you have in the south, you have to multiply that by 20 to 25%. So energy is my next priority, and then the last priority is transportation. There are no roads. A lot of the terrain is very inaccessible. We have problems in terms of transporting and getting to where we need to go. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Church, over to you. And we have just to remind folks, we have about 10 minutes left. And I want to again thank the folks at Wilson Center for making this possible.
Great, thank you. First of all, let me move to this question quickly then. This is a question I'm going to pose to former DASD Townsend, General Staudenross, and then Ms. Goodman and Ms. Ferguson. So strategically, we understand there's a lot of shortfalls and limiting factors to enable a force into the Arctic region. and things such as logistics, communications, energy. As you take a look, if you were to offer some reflections from your respective, and I'll sequence this up, but where to prioritize efforts that are most enabling for this future joint force, thinking about radical collaboration here in areas that enable the force. So what sort of outreach, what some sort of capabilities that are organic that need to be accomplished, because sometimes you don't necessarily have to build it to get the benefit of it. So let me first go to former DASD Townsend. Jim, your thoughts on this? Again, focusing on the kind of capability and then where to go to get it. Jim?
Well, from my background, as our Canadian colleague was talking about his priorities, he talked about communications, particularly, and you know these problems are in the European Arctic too, and they have wrestled with these for decades and decades. So as I look at and was thinking about the radical collaboration, you know, we can. And how hard it is. I mean, it's easy to collaborate. It's easy to go to Norway or to Finland. They're not even in NATO. They're very close to us, though. But it's easy to go there, send a delegation over. They'll put you in helos, take you up north to the various bases up there. And it might be that you can hear from them how they're going, how they're getting around the communications issues, how they're dealing with transportation, which was another shortfall our Canadian colleague was talking about. Transportation issues, how to deal with these problems. We come back and because of our regulations and laws and this type of thing, it's very difficult for us to adopt off the shelf their solutions. Instead, we have to go through and spend years of our own R&D and then procuring it and get budgeting. And it's just, I just, as I think about this, this radical collaboration, just in terms of communications, it would be great if we were to be able to go to North Norway and somehow acquire some of the solutions that they have in terms of comms. Or the equipment. Our Army colleagues were talking about, you know, snow vehicles and this type of thing, uniform items, you know, that type of thing, skis. And I know that that's certainly something we can do within the US, but I think there's solutions over there too that we can recognize through collaboration, but how do we get around actually making actionable those things that we see that they are doing that can apply to us, that can save us time, can save us money to go ahead and acquire ourselves instead of starting from scratch and doing it our way. And that takes years to reinvent the wheel. So I think collaboration on a radical basis is doable. It's something we can do in my theater of operations over there in Europe. I know we can do it. It's just that I think unless we can find workarounds, our own rules and regulations thwart us from actually making those actionable bits of collaboration. Is that what you're getting, Church?
That's home run, my friend. Let me pivot quickly to General Staudenraus. Thank you, Jim. Exceptional answer. Randy, you've got the floor.
I appreciate it. Yeah, going with Jim on allies and partners and working with that. Again, this is one of the things that the Guard has been excelling on, and the former SecDef was really big on pushing the state partnership program and those relationships and those change of ideas. The other one here, and it's more tactical, is we're not using what we have. So we haven't defined the problem. So this is, again, something that the state militia is doing. So underneath the National Guard with General Tory Sachs, is he's trying to get the local natives back on board with being part of the local militia, and then using that strength to go, what is the problem? How do we get there? And that goes back to the infrastructure problem before of, well, we could build it, but is that what we need? So we have to go back in, be there, find out what we need to find the problem, and then come back again. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Let me pivot to Iris for your reflections.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that from my perspective, you know, the Department of the Air Force strategy is also the Space Force strategy. And if I'm going to look for solutions to the future that are tangible and achievable now, I'm going to look to space assets. And we're seeing a real convergence of incredible technology that is coming online from the private sector, largely alongside it and drop in price. And so where things were once inconceivable, we're actually seeing immense opportunities, and communications in particular, looking at potential low Earth orbiting satellites and being able to partner with the private sector who maybe they would actually fund the launch and the actual system themselves, and we would lease from them. That's a revolutionary idea for the Department of Defense, to lease capabilities as opposed to own and operate. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to look to space for assets, whether it be for communications or domain awareness, ISR. That's my my big ticket push right now.
So let me first of all say thank you for that. Let me quickly go to Sherry. I've got people calling in ideas here, like I'm trying to manage too many things. Sherry, I'd like to give you the floor.
Sure, thank you. Just to add to those excellent comments, that I think the innovations that we need now as we move forward are not only in the technology, we need those innovations in the technology. And that's certainly true as we look to operate in a different kind of Arctic than we've been used to in the past. But we need also those innovations in in acquisition and contracting, where we often get stuck in our own systems. And I would say that it could be that the combination of the exceptionalism and the urgency of the Arctic challenge, combined with the fact that this new administration is going to be very climate forward in all departments, and they're leading into a major conference of the parties about a year from now, where there could be a kind of defense minister's angle to it, is to showcase the opportunities to use this next year to get those innovations in both the acquisition strategy. Here I'm thinking back to kind of SOCOM unique acquisition capabilities, or the ACTDs that we used to do, the leasing, a variety of tools and mechanisms we have for how to improve our acquisition of the innovative technologies, or improve the radical collaboration that's so much needed, could be put on the table. And I think there might be openings to take advantage of some of those new tools over the coming year or so.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to one more quick one, and then we give it to Dr. Schrager to bring it home. General Shields, I'd like to ask you one quick question regarding your reflections, and I know both you and General Garrett have spent time at the tactical level all the way through strategic in really employment of Army force in the high latitudes. As you think through the challenges that faces General Andresiak and General Andresiak's successors in advancing Arctic service in the U.S. Army, what would you offer as a reflection that would help, maybe perhaps the most bang for the buck in advancing Arctic service for the U.S. Army in the Arctic, and specifically, of course, U.S. Army Alaska? General Shields, the floor is yours.
Hey, Church, thanks for that. I think I touched upon it early in my comments. If you're talking about service in terms of recruiting and encouraging soldiers both to enlist to serve in the Arctic and really to matriculate there, I think it's about building that culture, that ethos and branding, right, and messaging. There's an Arctic tab I think you're familiar with, and others are familiar with, which is really important for leaders to attain, as well as soldiers as well. I think there's an opportunity for the Army to also relook, the Ram's Head device for active guard and reserve. That's something also instills pride. I talk about, the ability to message really the nation, and Pete touched upon it as well, right? And that's influencing and to educate, right? I think that's going to be important. I think serving in the Arctic is exciting. It's getting more exciting for a number of reasons, and we've got great units that are in the Arctic. Certainly with the Airborne Brigade, and I'll not be parochial and not be infantry, but there's a Stryker Brigade in Fort Wainwright. I didn't say that. Okay, and so there's a lot of opportunity from a combat service support perspective. And so it's a great opportunity. I think we just have to get that word out there, but also continue to build that ethos, that culture, that mindset, and then brand and market in the right way. And like I said, it's a great place to serve. Over.
Outstanding. General, I sincerely appreciate it. Dr. Shrega, back to you, sir.
Church, thank you. And thank you, my friend, for the partnership between ADAC and the Wilson Center. If nothing else, this certainly highlights the utility, power, and friendship that we have this kind of discussion. I want to thank this incredible panel and also give you a heads up that we will likely be calling you again. This might be one theme and one program we revisit in 2021 sometime appropriately and build out on, because I think this was an extremely useful, thorough, and insightful discussion. As church, both of my cell phones have been going nonstop since we started, which tells us we need to do this again. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank the incredible staff at Wilson, John, Treyon, Tracy, Michaela. You can't see them, but they're there and they're making things happen for us. I want to thank all of you. Colonel Clark, thank you for laying out the vision, the next steps, the components of those steps. We certainly want to hear more about that. We thank you for laying the foundation. General Andresiak, I'd like for you perhaps to give us your closing thoughts, your perspective on what you've heard today, and any closing ideas or thoughts you might have to conclude this panel.
I just appreciate all the support and the feedback. I think there is a lot that we heard today, much like last week, that reaffirms kind of the direction that we're going. I would tell you that I'm grateful that I have the easier part of this, I think, in terms of the tactical aspect of just getting out and building the readiness and make sure we do it safely. But in terms of the strategic approach and some of the bigger ideas, that's the idea of radical, right, collaboration. I mean, there's a lot from the tactical to the strategic that's got to happen, and I just appreciate the feedback. It's great for us. I know it's going to go back and JP will get it up to General Garricky. There's some things we'll run with. There's probably a lot of other ideas that we need to probably listen to. Maybe not even in this form. We probably just need to reach out and then kind of pick the brains of all the other experts that are out there. That there's areas that we're not looking at. We got to take into consideration. But I sincerely appreciate the time that you all put into this to set us up for success and posture us to be in a better place here in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, General. So on behalf of my friend Church, all the team at Wilson and ADAC, thank you all for watching. Many of you still on. Thank you all. To the panelists, thank you all. We'll look forward to working with you in the future. And I wish you a good afternoon or a good evening wherever you are tuning in from. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the day.